Hello, everyone. We're here on a Friday afternoon, continuing our Secret Society series with War Hamster Brady. How are you, Brady?
I'm good. I had a little bit of a dental procedure this morning, and I'm a little numb. So if I start drooling, that'll be the reason. But I think I can speak. I think I can speak somewhat clearly. It's getting better.
Awesome. Okay, well, we're going to focus today on the Bush family, and I'm going to let War Hamster kind of lead the way, and I'm going to fill in some gaps on the Walker piece of the family, but let's go.
Yeah, well, let's take a step back. And again, the whole purpose of this series has been to, figure out who controls the puppet strings and these corridors of power. And what we're finding is, you've got families going back centuries. They intermarry. They basically go to the same schools, join the same clubs, etc. Sit on each other's boards of directors, and they are basically, it's an oligarchical class. It's the big club that we ain't in. And one of the best examples of this in the 20th and 21st century was the Bush clan. And you really can't talk about the Bushes without some of the surrounding families that they've been around. A lot of that having to do, of course, with the Yale connections and Skull and Bones. But to have this conversation about what the last 3 or 4 generations of Bushes have done, it's a very unique political dynasty. We need to go back, just to paint the whole story. You need to know who they're connected with, and you can't talk about the Bushes without talking about the Harriman family. You've got to talk about the Dulles family. You got to talk about the Lovett family. So we're going to kind of try to give a chronological description of how each different generation they oversect for these different families, what they did, and how that tied into what some people call the Bush crime family of the 20th century. Fair enough?
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted to start with a quote, and this is from our good friend Woodrow Wilson toward the very end of his presidency. He kind of, this guy, he was a, if I can pull that, he was an academic, excuse me, that's the tongue, who, basically became president of the United States. Well, he'd figured things out after 2 terms. And what he said was, I'll give you the full quote here. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the fields of commerce and manufacture know that there is a power so organized, so subtle, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. And we have a pretty good idea of what they're referring to. That's really these are the puppet masters, the shadow state, and even the president of the United States, talking about these captains of industry, even they won't go head to head with them. And that's pretty much the story we're going to tell today. But we've got to be careful when you go into genealogy type conversations, because there's some very lazy work on the internet. When I was looking into the Bush family history, and it's important, it is a big part of the story. Hold on, where'd I put that? The genealogists at the New England Historical Genealogical Society, pretty reputable bunch. The main guy they have there is a guy by the name of Gary Boyd Roberts, and he's a senior research scholar emeritus at a foundation that does nothing but genealogy. So we're going to consider that a pretty good source, right?
You would think.
He says, and how they measure the way someone's related to somebody is that, 1,024th, like Elizabeth Warren. Yeah, I mean, there's some of that too, but these bloodlines, these connections, they're going to blow your mind. He goes, in addition to his son, the 43rd president, George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st president, was also related, albeit distantly, to President George Washington, John Quincy Adams, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Grover Cleveland, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft of Skull and Bones, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Barack Obama through the Massachusetts Hinckleys. 18 former presidents of the United States have some kind of tie to the Bush family. Pretty amazing, huh?
So one of the big highlights when I first began this, when I was reading Anthony Sutton's book, and he made the point that FDR was related to all but two of the former presidents.
Yeah, I've heard similar. And, FDR, well, FDR is fun when we talked about it last week because of the Delano family, and they pop up in the Bush story. FDR's the Delano side of it against, once again, opium smuggling family. That's where they made their money, the Delanos. Going a little deeper into that. So that's 18 presidents that the Bushes are related to. How about 16 first ladies, including both Ellen and Edith Wilson, Mamie Eisenhower, and Nancy Reagan? So 16 first ladies. You kind of get into
That's crazy.
Kind of get the picture that you have to be from certain families to even be considered for the top political positions.
Unless your last name is Trump.
Yeah, well, he's an exception in many ways.
Yes.
And yeah, there's people, you see some genealogy that Trump's related to, I don't know, you heard like the Queen of England and stuff like that. Maybe I'll check it on the same source, see what they say. All right, some more Bush connections, because there's some interesting ones. Other political figures: John Hancock, Stephen A. Douglas, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. All right, here's a big one: Henry Cabot Lodge I. You remember that name?
He features prominently in Operation Gladio often.
Yeah, and well, his son Henry Cabot Lodge II. He was Nixon's VP candidate in 1960. Was an ambassador to the UN, but Cabot Lodge I was real good friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and he basically he's the one who proposed a bill so we'd have secret elections. So that's a good thing he did. But he's the big senator from Massachusetts. He would stop the League of Nations after the Treaty of Versailles. He was very much opposed to it. But basically, his structure is what ended up becoming the United Nations. And of course, he's a guy, big war hawk, supported the Spanish-American War, pushed the United States into World War I. That's Henry Cabot Lodge first.
And that's what I was trying. What I noticed is all of the precursor Gladio kind of regime change stuff had a lodge there, and then a lot of it post World War II has a lodge involved in it as well.
Yeah, and the other thing you're going to find out about it is a lot of these big names are going to be either Democrat or Republican. That is completely bipartisan. It is about a corrupt machine, not a political party. A few other names that he's related to: William Rehnquist, Mitt Romney, Sir Winston Churchill. And I thought just some other non-political names. I've got Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Betty Davis and Katharine Hepburn, Henry and Jane Fonda, Michael Douglas, the actor, the Beach Boys, or some of them, Eli Whitney, of course, from the Whitney family, Norman Rockwell, and to close out, both the British and American Astor families all have some kind of genealogy to the Bushes.
That's just crazy.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I could see, being related to a few presidents, what have you, but our political system has been that incestuous. And again, I'd like to see the methodology of how these genealogists make the connection. Because if it's a 38th cousin 6 times removed, it doesn't really. But if there's a connection, these people keep their records and say, okay, well, this, he comes from the right bloodline, so they keep those books. If that's how the selection process works, then we're a lot less of a free society than we thought. And we've always known there's cronyism involved in politics. It's just we're not breaking anything new, but it's just the extent of it that's kind of shocking.
I agree.
Well, so we're going to go into the Bushes, which means the Walkers. We talked a little bit about how a lot of these families, what they'll do is, your name will be John, mother's maiden name, father's last name, or that way. You see, that's why you had the Walker Bushes. George Herbert Walker was named after their famous matriarchal sires, George Herbert Walker. And that's really common with these families. But why don't you jump in and tell about the history of the Walkers? Because they've been around this country a long time and have been very prominent.
So, let me go back here. we come, so the Walkers come in with, are you sure you don't want to talk about Prescott Bush? Because he marries the Walker.
Well, I was hoping we do Walker first and then jump in,
Okay.
because
All right.
I think Grandpa George Herbert Walker was probably
Okay.
where.
So Dorothy Walker marries Prescott Bush, and that's where the uh, Walker family intertwines with the Bush family, and we'll go into Prescott Bush because he's kind of the linchpin to everything. So she's the daughter of George Herbert Walker Sr. Now, George Herbert Walker Sr. obviously is Bush Sr. is the namesake of this guy, right? He's named after him. And you're going to see this repeated over and over and over again. If you look at the uncles and the cousins, they all have a derivative of the exact same names as we go down through each family tree. So, for example, George Herbert Walker Sr. has two children, well, three, Dorothy, that marries the Bush, George Herbert Walker Jr., and John M. Walker. So again, these names are going to repeat themselves. So the George Herbert Walker Sr. grows up in Missouri, and his family is originally from Maryland. And his dad is David Davis Walker, who we'll get to in a minute. And he goes and sets up a dry goods store in Bloomington, Illinois. And eventually, this morphs into Burlington Industries, like the Burlington store in your mall. He's kind of the godfather of that whole thing. So Walker is a Roman Catholic. He actually went to a Jesuit boarding school, and very interesting. And let's see, he created a banking company called G.H. Walker and Company in the year 1900. He also helped organize the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, and he was intimately involved in the Democrat Party in the Midwest. So there was a company that I see a lot in Operation Gladio research around the early 1900s time. That's spelled America, but it's Amerika. And so Walker became president of W.A. Harriman and Company's investment company, and took control of a part of that organization that was a transatlantic shipping enterprise out of Hamburg, Germany. So
let me jump in on that real quick, because the how he became the partner with the W.A. Harriman Company is a fascinating story. You have to go back to E.H. Harriman, one of the famous railroad robber barons of the late 1800s. And he had two sons. Well, I think he had three. There's two that are notable. One was Averill Harrington, and his brother, who we'll get to in a second. Averill Harrington was a member of Skull and Bones. And his younger brother was a bonesman the following year, and classmates of Prescott Bush. So that's the Harriman connection. And it goes even deeper than that. But the Harrimans, Averill Harrington, at the time his father passed away, that's E.H. Harrington, was the richest. He inherited more money than any person in the United States history. And we can go deeper into the whole railroad robber barons. I've got a lot of notes on that. But E.H. Harriman is, he produced a lot of the money for a lot of these shenanigans. It's really important that we talk about how they got involved.
And what's important about what you just said is the locking up of the railroad side with the shipping side, because that's how arms trafficking, drug trafficking, and all of this other transportation happens is many of these families have within their close proximity the access to the shipping and the railroad for the transportation. So when they were doing the bootleg liquor from Britain and bringing it across to Canada and down into the United States, they use these networks. So it's very important to understand those connections. And so that's a little bit about, oh, and they also had connections through the senior, let's see, George Herbert Walker Sr. to a whole bunch of other, the Missouri Pacific Railroad, Union Banking Corporation, American International Corporation, and also a company by the name of Brown Shipley, which was a private bank in London. And its history goes all the way back to like 1800. So very close ties to the city of London banking industry.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out during the railroad wars, Harriman almost crashed the stock market in 1901 when him and and J.P. Morgan were fighting over Northern Pacific. It was a big deal. The stock of Northern Pacific went from about $114 a share to over $1,000 in a 3-day period. There were short squeezes everywhere, and finally, Harriman and Morgan had to play nice and basically say we're not going to require the shorts to cover, and they basically stabilized the markets. J.P. Morgan was a scoundrel in many ways, but he has stabilized markets. 1895, he helped save the gold standard, dumped about $62 million into bonds. But you talk about the London banking connection. E.H. Harriman, basically created a consortium. He's a Wall Street banker, pretty sharp guy, had gotten involved in the railroad through marriage and did really well at a young age. The guy only died in his early 60s, so he made a ton of money. But he basically got together a consortium. First guy he's working with is his financier was Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff, of course, was a agent of the London Rockefellers. I'm sorry, the Rothschilds. You also had J.P. Morgan here taking care of the equity side of things, underwriting railroads, Rockefellers producing the oil, Carnegie's in steel, and J.P. Morgan's railroad partner is a guy by the name of James Hill, and he was another really prominent railroad guy. These people made a ton of money during they call it the Second Industrial Revolution, which is about 1870 to 1914, where we had this massive expansion of railroads. Generational fortunes were built and lost.
And that's the reason why they were down in Latin America, locking up all of the custom houses for trading partners and building the railroads down there to facilitate the Sullivan and Cromwell crowd of the expansionism to create a market for all of the goods that were being manufactured in the United States. So this is not just a story about America. This is a story about world conquest as well.
Oh, absolutely. And you can see it's for commercial purposes. The people, you've got the richest trusts in America, the industrialists, this new American money is looking to expand internationally, and they need the help of the U.S. government. That's why they put their people in place to determine what our foreign policy would be. They had to have their people in the State Department. They had the right committees, the right institutions. So that's really the big picture of this whole thing.
And Harriman was a member of the group that went to Russia in the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution and did railroads throughout Russia as well. So just a few links. But here's another part of this and it seems, again, going back to the whole bootlegging, railroads versus shipping and all that other stuff. George Herbert Walker Sr. has connections to, at the time, what I found in doing research into a lot of these founders prior to the CIA being created, where we were using the wealthy people as part of the OSS and feeding into that. If you go back into their backgrounds, a lot of them have links to mafia. And one of the links to mafias were racetracks, right? So you would not be at all surprised to find out this guy was created a syndicate with W. Averill Harriman and built Madison Square Gardens and the Belmont racetrack for horse racing. And they actually called it a syndicate. That is where the Walker Cup came from in the U.S. Golfing Association, because he was involved in that as well. The Walker Cup is named after the Walker family.
Yeah, you'll find a lot of these families really emphasized athleticism and athletics. George H.W. Bush was a baseball player at Yale, famous pictures he always bragged about. But they did put a lot of money towards athletics, a lot of these different families. And part of the reason for that is you're going to find a lot of trace of eugenicists in this family tree. And I'll get to that in just a second. I'll get a little further in my notes, but there is a lot of that Anglo supremacy, white supremacist, the master race. That connection is all through their philosophy. You will see that over and over again. It's a whole thing about the bloodlines, but yeah, they had a big emphasis on athletics.
Okay, so he has this Walker. In addition to Dorothy, they have 6 total kids. Dorothy, who of course marries Prescott Bush. They had George Herbert Walker Jr., who was the co-founder of the New York Mets. And they had a Dr. John M. Walker Sr., who was the CEO of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and the father of Judge John M. Walker Jr. Is that crazy?
No, families, a lot of connections there. And we looked a couple of weeks ago, we were looking at the boards of directors of one of the foundations, and we found a Walker sitting right there smiling at us. And the guy,
yes.
I look like definitely a cousin of the Bushes.
So. Okay. So now George Herbert Walker Sr.'s dad is a guy by the name of David Davis Walker. And he was born in 1840 and lived to 1918. Okay, so he died right after World War I. So he also was in Missouri and in the dry goods business. And he originally grew up in Illinois. This guy, David Davis Walker, is we'll get to him in a minute. He was the first cousin of Senator and Supreme Court Justice David Davis. That's who he's named after. Okay, so Supreme Court Justice David Davis, David Davis Walker's is his namesake, and he has quite an interesting, I'm not going to go into it in total, but he has a very interesting, he served on Abraham Lincoln's as his campaign manager when he ran in 1860. So he's tied into the very beginnings of the Republican Party route. He was known as a workaholic, also talked about the Burlington Industries. And okay, so he marries a woman by the name of Martha Beakey, Beaky. And he moved to Walker's Point in Maine, and that's kind of where the main compound in Kennebunkport began, was with this guy. Now, his father is George E. Walker. Okay, we don't know a lot about George E. Walker, but we do know something about George E. Walker's father. All right, so now we're George E. Walker's father is Thomas Walker. We've got Thomas, George, David Davis, George Herbert Walker Sr., and then Dorothy, who marries Prescott Bush. So that's our pecking order. So who was Thomas Walker? Well, Thomas Walker has a very interesting background because he is the branch that came over to the his descendants, came over to the U.S. because he was actually born in England, in Bristol. And he was a ship captain at what was considered to be one of, if not the major slave trading port in Britain, was Bristol. And it just so happens that Thomas Walker was a slave trader. He was a slave ship captain that operated out of Sierra Leone region in West Africa. Now, what I found very interesting about him, because I didn't know this, and that's what you find out about all of this, that area of Africa was known for rice plantations. And people who are from South Carolina know that there is a large rice plantation presence in South Carolina. And the reason that is because of these slaves coming over from Sierra Leone. His business was from South Carolina to Sierra Leone. That was his slave trading route. And a lot of the people that was originally brought over from Africa into South Carolina as slaves was brought over on his ship. So,
yeah, there were fortunes built in the transatlantic slave trade. A lot of them were American fortunes.
So one last tidbit. How did he die? He was such an evil person that his entire crew mutinied and killed him at sea.
Excellent footnote to a storied career. So the only thing I'd add on the Walker side is we had two other Walkers that were members of Skull and Bones a little bit later, and those would have been, double check the names. George Herbert Walker Jr. was a bonesman in 1927. He was the one who would end up founding the New York Mets. And John M. Walker was related. He became a physician and investment banker. And then George Herbert Walker III was bonesman, class of 1953, would end up being the U.S. ambassador to Hungary, which is kind of impressive.
And your first one would have been the brother of Dorothy Walker, the brother-in-law of Prescott Bush.
Perfect. So you're right. Prescott is really where the things start to take off. But before we jump into him, you got to go back at least one generation for him because it opens up some doors.
You're kind of breaking up, Brady.
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me know if it continues. It shouldn't be an issue. I mean, my internet's fine.
No. Yeah, I'm still getting a breakup.
Let's see what the audience says.
That was better.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. I'll just try not to move. So we got to go back to Samuel Bush, who was George H.W.'s great-grandfather, Prescott's father. Now, this is the guy who became president of a company called Buckeye Steel, which was partially owned by Standard Oil. Standard Oil, of course, is the flagship of the Rockefeller fortune and family. His predecessor at Buckeye Steel was Frank Rockefeller, who's John D. Rockefeller's youngest brother. So he turns Buckeye into gets into the gun barrel and artillery shell production right before World War I. And so basically he's a war profiteer. Then he goes to D.C. in 1917 to run the Small Arms, Ammunition, and Ordnance of the War Industries Board. So here is Grandpa Samuel, great-grandpa, depending on who we're talking about, basically sitting on one of the most powerful boards dictating U.S. war policy. And, he's got a lot of backing. And he's also benefiting his own company at the same time because he still owns president of Buckeye Steel. So that's the background. There's big connections that Samuel Bush made. He basically he came out of Ohio and basically was able to settle in on the Eastern establishment, which is what Prescott gets born into. And, well, we're going to have to spend some time on Prescott. So he's actually born in Columbus, Ohio. His whole career, he was a eugenicist. He founded something called the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood. So that's Prescott, but there's a lot more to him. He goes to Yale, follows his grandfathers, goes to Yale, and becomes a member of Skull and Bones. Of note, he is part of the class of Skull and Bones that allegedly went and dug up the grave of Geronimo and stole his skull for their temple. That's apparently controversial, but urban legend says that is true, that did happen. So he marries well. He marries the daughter of George Herbert Walker, which really helped him. He immediately gets to be the president of W.A. Harriman and Company because he was a classmate to E. Roland Harriman at Yale and in Skull and Bones, and that's how he got involved with the Harriman family. Obviously, W. Averill Harriman, the older of the Harriman brothers, was a titan in Democrat politics, and yet the Bushes were more involved with Republican politics, yet they worked together side by side, financing both issues, both sides. So Averill Harriman and Prescott Bush are overlapping all throughout their career. Prescott's mostly a Wall Street banker, was a politician for a short period of time. We'll get to that. A couple other I'm jumping over to Harriman real quick because I think that needs to be done. I talk about Harriman being a titan in Democratic politics. He was an ambassador to the USSR during the war from 1943 to 46. This is W. Averill Harriman.
Right.
Go ahead. No, he became Truman's Secretary of Commerce for 3 years, and then he became governor of New York for one term. Very, very powerful guy. Another guy who comes into the play with these guys is Robert Lovett, and we discussed him a bit last week, but he was a bonesman in 1918. We'll skip back to him in a bit, but I wanted to bring him up here because he's part of that same class as Prescott Bush and the Harriman boys. All the three of those guys were Skull and Bones at about the same time.
And I want to, before you jump off of Averill Harriman, I want to point out a couple of things. His time at the National Recovery Administration, the NRA was basically, there was a law that was that it accompanied this organization, and it basically, according to Anthony Sutton, was the insert into a fascist / socialist, basically transforming America. It was the first attempt to make us not a republic, because it kind of basically went back to monopolies with all of these trade organizations and labor and all of this other stuff for massive control by the oligarchs. Well, the law was struck down as unconstitutional, and that's how we ended up with the kind of New Deal, which was kind of the socialist light version of the original law that he tried to pass. And Harriman was instrumental in this effort. So I just wanted to add that.
Excellent. So Prescott Bush, I think he does 2 years in the war and then joins Harriman and Brothers. About 10 years later, Harriman Brothers merges with the Brown Brothers. Brown Brothers, a very old Wall Street firm founded in 1818. Drove a lot of the growth of Wall Street, underwrote some of the earliest railroad deals, real big driving force of Wall Street becoming the center of finance in the Western world. So these two firms merge in 1931, and it's called Brown Brothers Harriman. Just call them BBH. And it's going to be really prominent in the rest of the story. The original founding partners included two Brown brothers, two Harrimans, both Roland and Averill, Prescott Bush, Robert Levitt, once again, Skull and Bones, and interestingly, a guy named Moreau Delano of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yeah, he pops up in these founding fathers. And it's a very legitimate Wall Street bank. Timing's interesting. This is 1931, 2 years into the Great Depression. And not the best time ever for banking, unless you happen to be on the right side of certain trades.
I was going to say they did fine, though.
Yeah, well, that's because the ones who knew it was coming were able to buy up a bunch of shares on the cheap from everyone else.
Yes, they knew it was coming.
You ever heard this theory that the reason the Federal Reserve actually caused that was because they were trying to go after Bank of New York?
Yes, I have.
Bank of New York at the time was known as the Jewish Bank. and the Federal Reserve was not considered the Jewish bank, despite a lot of people. Some people think the Jews own the Fed. Well, maybe an awful lot of Jewish people are involved in the Federal Reserve. But the New York Fed actually tried to bankrupt Bank of New York in 1929. Didn't succeed, but they came close. There was a big divide on Wall Street between the Protestant banks and the Jewish banks, and the Protestant ones most certainly had the power until all the way through most of the 20th century. You make arguments now that Goldman Sachs and a few of the other Jewish-based banks, but there's more crossover now than we had 50 years ago, when certain Wall Street banks would not hire a Jewish person, period. But there definitely was that war going on.
And I also want to make mention, because I think it's important to keep focusing this internationally too. Like we were talking about with the Harrimans in Russia and doing the railroads and stuff like that. You're also going to find, according to this book of Sullivan and Cromwell, which I know is one of your favorite topics, that Averell Harriman also hired Sullivan and Cromwell to complete what was referred to as his pet project, financing the electrification of Poland, because he was actually involved in electrification with GE of Russia. And so they also moved on. Harriman had agents in Poland, and the Sullivan and Cromwell's office in Berlin actually helped them accomplish that task. And so I found that very interesting.
Yeah, you bring on the Dulles brothers. That definitely ties right into the next chapter. So we've got 1931. Prescott's a founding partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, and most of his clients, or had a lot of big customers that were basically German interests that he's dealing with slightly illegally. A guy by the name of Fritz Thyssen, who owned what's called United Steelworks, that was a Prescott client. They would use a Dutch shell bank under this company called Union Bank Corporation, UBC. Well, Bush sat on the board of UBC from 1934 onwards. UBC would get seized or investigated in 1942 in the United States under the Trading with the Enemy Act,
of which Bush was part of.
Absolutely. He was on the board of UBC. Basically, we were financing the Nazis and the Russians at the same time, which we've talked about. What I found interesting is Bush sat on a lot of other boards at the time. He sat on the board of Brown Brothers Harriman, the U.S. Guarantee Corporation, Prudential Insurance, CBS, your favorite Pan American Airways, which, of course, is a CIA front.
CIA front, yes.
But also sitting on the board, he was of Dresser Industries. And we talked about them last week. Just to remind everyone, who did Dresser Industries become? Halliburton.
Yeah.
So the Bush connection goes back 3 generations to Halliburton. Somehow Dick Cheney, the president of Halliburton, becomes the vice president of George W. Bush. Ought to be asking some questions about that one. Dresser Industries comes up all over this story.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much Prescott in a nutshell. There's more to him. The Dulles brothers connection. So while Bush is having these German industrial clients, so are the Dulles brothers, John Foster and Allen Dulles. Once they sat at the table at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, they got back into investment banking for their old law firm, which is Sullivan and Cromwell. The stories can go on and on. Their clients were German industrialists. That's where they met Prescott Bush and had all kinds of carryover. There's actually no coincidence that when the Dulles brothers were pegged, when Allen Dulles was pegged to head the FBI, there was Bush and Skull and Bones fingerprints all over it. I was asked last week, weren't the Dulles brothers Skull and Bones? No, they weren't. They both went to Princeton and to George Washington University Law School. So they could not have been bonesmen, but they had the same clientele with Brown Brothers Harriman and Sullivan and Cromwell. Absolutely crossed over dozens and dozens of times. So Prescott Bush was in tight with the Dulles brothers from day one. Another guy Prescott became pretty good friends with at the time was William Pauley. And you've done Polly ad nauseum. If you want to just do a quick summation for new listeners.
William Polly was kind of my first big eye opener into the international syndicate. I came across him kind of just in a weird. I first came across him in Cuba. So I learned early on that in these countries, during this period of time we're talking about, which is why I keep bringing the international piece of this up, through Nelson Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, all of these people, we would go country by country around the world, and we actually created the elite class in these countries. So William Polly was basically CIA before CIA, OSS, all of this stuff. He was one of those corporate agents, and he went into Cuba. He owned the airline, the only airline. He owned all of the busing. He owned sugar plantations, and the people that worked for him were the elite. So he takes corrupt people, puts them in charge of all of these things, and then they manipulate everything going on. So William Polly shows up in Cuba. He becomes an ambassador to a handful of countries down in South America, all of which get couped from the CIA. He also shows up during World War II in Asia. He owns the Curtiss aircraft franchise for all of Asia. So he's over there spitting out aircraft for Chiang Kai-shek's Air Force, which eventually gets moved to Taiwan. He basically pays for their entire shipping, which probably came through one of these other companies. So William Polly is a corporate millionaire on the surface, but he is an intelligence operative as well this entire time. And he is one of many that performed this role, looking like a corporate executive while at the same time 1000% an intel operative. And Polly Island is named after him in South Carolina, just FYI.
Did not know that one.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, let's Prescott will show up again here a couple of times. I want to jump forward to George H.W. Bush, because that's where it gets into some of the real nitty-gritty of the story. George Herbert Walker Bush is born in 1924. Spent a little bit of time in the Navy, and then went to Yale in 1945. Was a bonesman. It's very likely he was recruited in the CIA while he was at Yale, because the CIA this is early CIA. They were recruiting a lot from the Ivy League schools, particularly Yale. And there's a guy, Coach Walsh, who was a crew coach, apparently was a CIA recruiter at the time. And Bush definitely, through his athletic background, knew the guy. So that's kind of rumored. I don't know if that's 100% sure that he was CIA at the time. But there's a theory out there. The guy by the name of Trento, who wrote Prelude to War, thinks that George H.W. Bush was recruited by the CIA on orders from Allen Dulles to keep as a wedge against Prescott if he needed it. So a little bit of intrigue there.
Well, and Dulles was known to do that to control people.
Sure, makes a ton of sense. So George H.W. Bush gets out of college, and right out of college he joins who? Dresser Industries, the
Halliburton's
predecessor to Halliburton. Well, at the time, Prescott, who had a controlling interest, or one of the big interests in Dresser, had named the CEO, one of his classmates at Yale in Skull and Bones, by the name of Neil Mallon, all class of 1918, same year as Lovetts, all bonesmen that year. Well, Neil Mallon's a CEO that Prescott's working for. Basically, he became an uncle figure to George H.W. George H.W., which is why Neil Mallon is the namesake for one of H.W.'s sons, Neil Bush. That's who he's named after. Mallon's also the guy to push H.W. to go to Texas. and where George H.W. Bush would start a company called Zapata Energy, which was down. We'll get into Zapata here in a second. Zapata they basically functioned in South and Central America. George H.W. Bush didn't know the first thing about oil when he got there. Do you want to talk about Zapata real quick, or do you want me to do the Cowboys?
Yeah, I'll take but I do want to go back just for 1 second. I want to talk about, just for my military brethren, I want to talk about his brief stint in the Navy. Because when I first read about his history and how his aircraft was shot down and how every other person that was involved in that mission was killed, to me, that just didn't seem right. So he's the lone survivor. So did it all happen or didn't it? Because it becomes very important in his whole overall, and I'm again, he was a crafted intelligence operative early on. He is one of these people that is being shaped and molded, and everybody loves a war hero. And there is not a stitch of information about the just random, finding him in the middle of the Pacific. They just so happen to find him and he's still alive and everybody else is dead. Honestly, I think the whole thing's garbage, but that's just my opinion. Because it fits in the line of everything else. Zapata oil, I found very interesting because when I was looking into the coups that happened in Cuba, I ran across Zapata. Zapata is a bay in Cuba that, according to several different articles that I read, within 12 months of the formation of Zapata oil under Bush, there was a geologist that wrote a report that said that there was a large oil discovery off of Zapata Bay, Cuba, and that is one of the reasons why they tried so desperately to get Cuba back, is because they knew secretly that there was oil off the coast of Cuba, and that they had already set the company up to be Zapata Oil to take advantage of that.
Excellent. That ties into what I was going to bring up next. This 1952 was a really important time. What's going on is there's a shift in the power base in the United States financially. The Yankee Blue Bloods had always dominated Wall Street. And what was happening post World War II is a shift towards the Cowboys, the entire Southwest. This is for both oil and the defense industry. And the Cowboys want to have an influence on foreign affairs, just like their northern brethren. And there was a bit of a cowboy and Yankee war going on to some degree. Obviously, sending Bush, who's absolutely George H.W. Bush, who was born and raised a Yankee, down to Texas so he could become a cowboy, is a very interesting way of mitigating that. Did Wall Street and big oil, big defense end up working together? The answer is yes. But at the time, there was a problem, and it was a political issue. So 1952, there was...
it.
What's that?
So you infiltrate it.
Exactly. So 1952, and again, these are Ivy League, skull and bones members are going down into Texas and Florida, et cetera. So that is infiltration. If you want to talk Cowboys versus Yankees. 1952 is the election of Eisenhower. And there was a thing going on called the draft Eisenhower, because he could have won as a Democrat or as a Republican.
Yeah.
So these Republican moneyed interests, this would be the Prescott Bushes, would have to work very hard to draft Eisenhower to be a Republican, which they did. And it worked out pretty well for those moneyed interests. Nixon would be Eisenhower's VP in 1952, basically to get the representation of the Cowboys. He was, California guy, all his California moneyed connections. That was part of the defense industry, Cowboys, they called them. This would start. The Eisenhower government is the start of American interventionism. I mean, we talk about they were doing some things beforehand. For it to be part of our actual policy That's when it started. There's a ton of Brown Brothers Harriman links to Nixon. There's a book called Family Secrets that describes even more links to Prescott Bush. At the time, here's the link. Dresser Industries was expanding into Whittier, California. That was Nixon's hometown. Yes. And that's where the connection came from. Nixon, during his time in office, would appoint Herbert Walker to multiple positions. The Dulles brothers were appointed Secretary of State and Director of the CIA during the Eisenhower administration. Nelson Rockefeller became a special advisor to the president.
For what? For what area?
Just a special advisor at large.
South America.
Oh.
He specialized in Latin America, because it was during this time that he sets up this organization called like the CIIA that is specifically used. And it was their money that started the whole Wycliffe Bible College, Bible translators from the Summer Institute of Language that all goes down into Latin America and scouts out the indigenous Indians for slaughter. Yeah, Eisenhower's role specifically focused on Latin America.
Excellent. Who else gets appointed? Well, in this friendly Eisenhower cowboy-backed administration. Oh, remember my good friend Lovett? He became the Secretary of Defense under Eisenhower. Oh, little circle got their guy in office. Something's created called the PIAB, the Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board, which is basically, just the unaccountable independent intel board who's accountable only to POTUS. Who sat on that first PIAB was Lovett.
So let me explain something to everybody, because this is huge, what you just said. Truman created the 10-2 National Security memo. And 10-2 basically is what gives the CIA the capability to do covert action. And in addition to the 10-2, 10-4 memo was the Presidential Intelligence Advisory Board. So you have the kind of trifecta, if you will. You have the CIA, the National Security Council, and the presidential, and all of these people all knew each other and had worked together prior to Eisenhower, very close-knit group. So they now have a lock on everything to do covert operations, which kicked, as you said, into high gear during Eisenhower as part of the creation of NATO. And you have to keep in mind that Eisenhower was in Germany after the war as basically the precursor to NATO, creating Operation Gladio with all of his counterparts over there. So just to put that in perspective.
No, that's good. It's very good stuff. So I got lost in my notes for a second. All right, so we're on the PIAB. The chairman of the PIAB is worth mentioning, and that was a Richard Russell Jr., who's a big LBJ supporter. LBJ was a Democrat wing of the Cowboys. Without a doubt, he's a big internationalist. Richard Russell, no relation to the, I don't think he's related to the founder of Skull and Bones Russell. I could not find a link there. But it's interesting about him. He also sat on the Warren Commission with some other interesting people. That's that Richard Russell Jr. Dulles had a pilot project in the Caribbean. He was setting up in April 1553. That's where H.W. Bush and Mallon met to meet with Allen Dulles. That's how the funding from Zapata came through. But really, this is what Eisenhower is all about. That's when all these pieces were put into place. We'll get more into H.W.'s presidency in a bit, but should we introduce George W. Bush?
Well, let me make one comment about your Dresser Industries, because they ended up hiring a guy or a company that was M.W. Kellogg Engineering. Do you know what it grows up to become? Kellogg Brown and Root. Which, of course, is kind of if you're not going to use Halliburton, you use Brown and Root. I mean, those two are like the two largest, and they all come from basically the same background.
Yeah, and there's a lot of money from military contracting, not just in weapons and stuff like that, but there's a lot of food, a lot of everything, and there's money to be made. Um,
Well, and that's the important part of going through this chronology that you're doing, is because you see that Eisenhower is the one that in 1950, it was Truman that got us into the Korean War. And you have Eisenhower, who commits the forces to Vietnam initially. He does the several coups, throughout his presidency. But you see the escalation starting with Truman, and you see they're in bed with the defense contractors. They all went to school together. They've all colluded together. And so after World War II, they did not want that demand for weapons to go away. And so they created the hierarchy of Operation Gladio, fake countries, fake banks, all that other crap to perpetuate this war machine. And what we're describing is how it's all tied together. And I just didn't want anybody to miss that.
yeah, it's the only time in U.S. history we didn't downsize after a war.
Correct.
And there's a very good economic reason for the justifiable one historically is we never got out of the Great Depression. FDR had terrible policies. We had to get into a world war and nationalize the government into a war-torn economy to get us out of the Great Depression. 1929 through 1939, there was no growth. In fact, there was a lot of terrible things. Americans were suffering. We ramped up our industrial base to fight the war, and it produced a lot of jobs, a lot of debt, a lot of very high taxes. Apparently the war is an existential threat. Let's go with that. Well, you get out of the war, and the United States is the only major economy that hasn't been bombed to smithereens by 2 world wars. We are going to be the world's producers. The problem is the people we need to sell things to didn't really have healthy economies themselves, and that's where the Marshall Plan comes in. Part of the deal to have this happen is the military industrial complex didn't want to be downsized. They couldn't retool completely to consumer goods, not 100%. They did to some degree, but that's really what happened post World War II. And these were active conversations they had before the war was over, when they're setting up the Bretton Woods banking system. This was all predetermined before Germany ever surrendered or anything dropped in Japan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's why you saw the same people emerge.
Correct.
So let's see. Oh, here's some fun stuff about. Oh, I forgot one little factoid about Zapata. Do you know who Bush ended up selling them to?
I don't remember.
It's a company called Harkin Energy, which was controlled by the BCCI.
Yes.
Yeah. So Bush.
Oh, but we found out that Bush had an account at BCCI too, by the way.
Okay. Which would make perfect sense. They're doing business together. They're trading entire companies.
The CIA agent, the CIA director, had an account at the CIA fake bank called BCCI.
So we get to that 1960 election. Eisenhower's termed out. Nixon's running for the Republicans, and he's going up against a guy by the name of JFK. And it was a very, very close race. Thanks to the Chicago Mafia, JFK comes out on top. And I'd make the argument that the people that had backed Eisenhower and Nixon were none too pleased. And those are the same people that was the CIA. Was the military-industrial complex. From day one, they'd beaten JFK. JFK's beaten them in an election. And he brings on Bobby, who's big anti-mafia attorney general. So there's tension from day one. Let's see. Oh, before Zapata was sold, George H.W. Bush, this is interesting, in the 60s, he was working very closely with not only the Saudis, but the Emir of Kuwait. It's important to bring this up because this is really the only family dynasty that had complete business connections with another part of the world going back generations, and it really influenced their foreign policy, as we saw. In the 1970s, we get the bin Laden family, or the Bush's connection to the Saudi families becomes very important. In 76, okay, well, first of all, Bush starts getting appointed to things by Nixon. When Nixon gets in 1968, So fast forward a little bit. George H.W. Bush starts getting appointed to some really interesting positions. He's Poppy Bush, or as H.W. is called, becomes a Texas congressman from 67 to 71, becomes a United Nations ambassador from 71 to 73. That's under Nixon. He became here's a fun one. He became the U.S. liaison to China in 1974 and 75. This is 1 year after Kissinger, or was it Brzezinski or Kissinger, whatever. I think it was Kissinger, went over there and opened up China to the West. Bush is the first guy playing gatekeeper to American companies who want to do business in China from day one. Pretty damn interesting position to be in.
After having been at the UN.
Oh, and his next position, of course, was Nixon names him as the director of the CIA. He's considered the first outside director since John McCone. Was he really an outsider, or was he working as a CIA asset? Pretty much going back to the 50s.
So there is a lot of evidence that he was in the CIA in the 50s.
Yes.
And I do want to mention, because there's a lot of people that are ignorant about the relationship between Taiwan and China, that up until we recognized China during the Nixon administration, Taiwan sat in the China seat at the UN. And that's very important to know, that from the creation of the UN basically was recognizing Taiwan as a government in exile as it related to the UN, and not mainland China.
Yeah, and it was a while back. There was a bunch of saber rattling 2 years ago about China's going to invade Taiwan, as there always is. It's interesting, and who owned Taiwan prior to that? And it was off and on. It was Japanese property as well, which is a very interesting story. Who's actually, if you go back to like the last 400 years, who's Taiwan belonged to the most? And it's really close. I think Japan had it by a couple of years. But
because they kept invading it.
Well, yeah, they were good at that.
But the actual Formosan people's lineage were Chinese for the most part.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. This gets us back into Yankees and Cowboys. H.W. Bush really was the liaison to connect the Yankees and the Cowboys. The Southwest being the new promised land. There's some great books on that. I can put the link. I can put the links in there. But one is a really good book called The Yankee and Cowboy War by a guy named Carl Oglesby. And he talks about the astonishing link between the JFK assassination and the deposing of Richard Nixon.
Yeah.
He draws a link there, which is interesting because we've already made the case that Nixon was absolutely connected to these old boys, these cowboys, who are basically in control of the intelligence agency. Yet we know it's crystal clear that the intelligence agencies are the ones who caused Watergate. It was Mockingbird Media and insiders that deposed him. Deep Throat and the Washington Post.
Well, the actual plumbers were Cuban exiles trained by the CIA at the Miami station.
Yeah, go figure. And of course, E. Howard Hunt led the break-in, was also at the Bay of Pigs.
Correct.
We talked about that over and over again. Oh, he was also in Dallas in 1963, but
correct.
I'm sure that's just a coincidence.
Yeah.
So that's your boy George H.W. Bush, becomes the director of the CIA in 1976. Reagan, because it looks like Reagan's going to be the the Republican nominee in 1980. Was interesting. It's a fascinating thing going on. Well, how did George H.W. Bush become his VP, especially with his storied background? Well, this is who the Cowboys wanted. If you wanted to bundle the money for Reagan, he needed these people's backing. And so he picked George H.W. as his running mate. Interesting choice in many ways. What was going on at the time for the 80 election was Iran had taken the U.S. Americans hostage in 1979, leading into 1980. And Carter tried to launch a rescue, and it didn't happen. We got evidence 10, 15 years later that Bush's CIA connections were negotiating behind the scenes with Iran, telling them not to release the hostages until the election was over. That was sort of what they call the October surprise. Everyone suspected it at the time, but now I think that it's been confirmed. Yeah, Carter tried to do the rescue in April of 1980. Bush is, as a VP, he's the one who ushered in the whole Iran-Contra, and
Angola.
yeah, all this stuff. And I remember Reagan commenting that my vice president is more involved in the government than any VP in history. Well, yeah, you let him run your foreign policy and your intelligence agencies, and look what happened. So that's yeah. Go ahead.
Let me bring up a commonality here too, because what I found in investigating the Nicaraguan labeling of people as communist in order to justify regime change, which is basically what Contra was, while at the same time supposedly dealing with Iran, who everybody told us that the Ayatollah was, not Western oriented at all. But yet we're disguising the sale of weapons to Iran as part of the Iran-Contra. But do you know who we were using as the cutout for weapons trafficking? Israel.
Yeah, it was absolutely the Israelis.
We also used Israel as the cutout for shipping weapons to the Contras too. And I was shocked to find out how often, because we also used Israel as the cutout for weapons trafficking to Angola, which was also Vice President George Bush, another national security 10-2, ran out of the White House intervention in another foreign country. And in that case, we were after their gold and other minerals that Angola had. But we were running guns because we couldn't trade directly with South Africa. So we used Israel as a cutout. They took the guns down to South Africa and then ran them across the border into Angola.
Yeah, it's the exact same time in the 1970s. Bush's family is getting into bed with two really important Saudi Arabian families, the bin Mahfouzes and the Bin Ladens. That's Osama bin Laden's family. He was radicalized at some point, but the Bushes most certainly did business. They for a long period of time. A guy by the name of James Bath, who was enlisted as a series. Yeah, he was a Texas businessman. You want to go into Bath? You probably have more on him than I do.
No, you go ahead. I'll do the backup here because this guy's fascinating. Go ahead.
Well, this Bath would help finance GW's Arbusto oil business with Saudi money, with the Bin Ladens, and well, if you fast forward a bit, the Bushes and Bin Ladens were both involved with the Carlyle Group. Carlyle had a subsidiary trained. One of the Carlyle subsidiaries trained the Saudi secret police, but the Bin Ladens were investors in Carlyle Group through this guy Bath.
And the Carlyle Groups, for everybody that doesn't know what that is, it's a private equity organization because this is insidious. It was a private organization, a private equity that bought shares of all of the military industrial complex as investments. They took outside money from all kinds of different sources as private equity to buy this large stake in military industrial complex. Well, what happens for anybody that owns a large stake in military industrial complex? They want perpetual war. And so you have this entire Carlyle Group who are the beneficiaries of the military aid and foreign aid going to all of these countries, one of which large portion was Saudi Arabia. And so you have the Carlyle Group advocating through lobbyists for foreign aid to Saudi Arabia, while at the same time, Saudi Arabia is part owners of the Carlyle Group from an investment standpoint, who is basically getting dividends from using our money to buy their weapon systems in a place that they own through the back door, a share of the weapon system companies. So our taxpayer dollars are being donated to a foreign government who is using those to buy from the military industrial complex, and they're getting kickbacks through their investments in the Carlyle Group. Just want to make sure everybody knows that.
Yeah, they say all wars are banker wars, but remember, most of those banker wars are investment banker wars. And that's what these guys are. They are investment bankers. And then on an international scale, that's what the Dulles brothers were. That's what Brown Brothers Harriman has been. That's what most of these intelligence people are bankers.
So back to Bath. Can we talk about his aircraft business, how they first met?
Please.
So the way they all first met, the Bin Laden family and the, however you say the other guy names, Mahfouz, who basically was like the central banker for Saudi, because he shows up all the time in the BCCI because the Saudis were a big investor in the fake CIA bank called BCCI. So you have the construction company, Bin Laden. The Bin Laden family was basically like that Brown and Root in America. They're very similar as far as the business model. So you have the Bin Laden family, billionaires, and you have this Mahfouz guy who is like the central banker for the Saudi Arabia. And they have a large need. They basically become kind of the go-to guys for anybody over in that area that wanted these large luxury aircraft. Well, Bath owned a company that took basically excess aircraft from either airlines or military or whatever, and he converted them into like $100 million airplanes. I'm like just outrageously over the top, gold plated, this, that, and the other. And that's how he originally meets these two people. He also, they did all of their business through National Commercial Bank, which was a very large bank in Saudi Arabia that Mahfouz guy was part of that with. So Bath is also the book that I was using for our BCCI series. He shows up in that book. It's called The Outlaw Bank. As part of the whole BCCI and the money laundering stuff, he's right in the middle of that as well. He's also, if you guys want any other information on him, that book called The House of Bush, House of Saud, that's on my Substack, I highly recommend you read that because it shows from way back the intimate relationship between the Saudis and the Bush family, and it will knock your socks off.
Yeah, there is a lot there to unpack. So here's this director of the CIA, VP of the United States, becomes the president of the United States. Going back to the Iran hostage scandal, first of all, second Reagan wins the election. Iran plays nice. We get our hostages back, and America's feeling great again. We've got this USA thing. Well, Iran's now the bad guys, the death to America. So, of course, Bush and his faction in the military-industrial complex want to arm Saddam Hussein to be a bulwark against Iran, which is what they do for the better part of 10 years. And at one point in time, we had Iraq and Iran fired shots and everything like that. Bush allowed Saddam Hussein, who he had a lot of business contacts with over the years, and his business partners did as well, allowed him to keep arming himself. And it is said that he even encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait, despite the fact that Bush had Kuwaiti business connections. The second he crosses into Kuwait, obviously we unleashed holy hell in the first Desert Storm operation. But that was a huge scandal.
So you have the entire 1980s of us arming Iraq and Israel through the back door arming Iran. Europeans are doing both sides as well. So there is about a multi-year war, like tens of thousands of people are dead as a result of the war between Iraq and Iran, all through the 80s, like almost the entire decade. And that was instigated and encouraged by NATO. And you have, during that same time, Iran, we created, and this was all part of Bush's part of this as well. We created the thing called the SAVAK, SAVAK. Major General Norman Schwarzkopf, our Norman Schwarzkopf of Desert Storm, dad was the creator. That's why Norman Schwarzkopf, when he talks about growing up and spending time in Iran, his dad was over there creating their national police, which were butchers. And so all of this drama between these two things. So I want to explain about the whole invasion of Kuwait, because I had just got to Italy the day they invaded. What happened in the lead up to that, the week prior to it, about 5 days before that, the UN or the US ambassador liaison to Iraq tells Saddam Hussein, we understand that you're right. Kuwait has been horizontally drilling into Iraqi oil fields, stealing your oil. You have every right in the world to make them stop and get your oil fields back. So whatever you feel necessary to do, you just go ahead and do that. Know that you have our backing. So Saddam Hussein, within the next week, launches the attack on Kuwait, and the Kuwaitis, working with Bush, are the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter gets up in front of Congress and says that they were dumping babies out of incubators and all this other stuff. That was all coordinated by Bush's CIA, who obviously is not part of the Bush thing right now, but that was all an orchestrated, because, I mean, as far as Bush being literally the CIA, because he's the president, this was all orchestrated.
Well, you know, that's what you just described is called Iraqgate, and it really wasn't going to be investigated, and it really didn't get investigated for like another decade, which is too bad. The guy who blocked a lot of those investigations was a guy by the name of Bill Barr. We've ever seen him do that before. But, you know, George H.W. Bush during the election went from having an approval rating of 89% all the way down to 37% in just 14 months. Now, he got just wiped out by Clinton and Perot in 1992. But he went from being a very popular president when, you know, first invasion with Iraq started to when all this scandals started coming out. That includes Iran-Contra. On Christmas Eve of 1992, 1 month before leaving office, he issues a pardon for Caspar Weinberger, who was getting investigated criminally for the Iran-Contra stuff. And that put a stop to all of the bodies that could have been uncovered and unburied through Iran-Contra. We never got through that. So everyone's ticked off about Joe Biden pardoning his son. Well, there's precedent, you know, of doing something to block the investigation. And again, that pardon didn't have a crime named with it. It was a blanket pardon. That's not constitutional. That's blanket immunity. You shouldn't be able to do it, but we set the precedent. So we live with it. And that's your boy, George H.W. I mean, there's a lot more to him. We got time to talk about George W.
Go ahead.
He is a handful himself. So even with all the scandal about his dad, his grandfather being running the only company ever to be investigated under the Trading with the Enemies Act, his dad being CIA, all these Iraq scandals, all these Iran scandals, all these Zapata offshore connections, all that stuff, our media is friendly enough that he can step right in 2000 and succeed Bill Clinton.
Well, yeah, you can say whether he actually just like stepped in. I mean, we do probably need to mention the hanging Chad thing.
Sure. Talk about the 2000 election.
Well, because it literally changed every election after that, right? The whole driven electronic voting system happened as a result of the 2000 election. Now, you know, to me, that was one of the most pivotal points in American history during our lifetimes.
Yeah, without a doubt. And who was he running against?
Al Gore.
Mm-hmm. Gore's got an interesting connection in there as well. Best part was in 2004 when it was Bush against John Kerry. You had Bonesman versus Bonesman. Thought that was pretty impressive.
Given Kerry's background. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you know what to say about George W. Bush. I mean, everyone already knows. We know he's skull and bones. We've got all kinds of these connections. In his presidency, what did he do? He started another war in Iraq. And obviously he did that by manipulating the intelligence agencies to lie about their intelligence product. There were no weapons of mass destruction, but he was going to have his war no matter what.
Well, in his war, you have Richard Pearl. One of the most fascinating things in all of the research that I've done was I found the document that Richard Pearl and Frank Luntz wrote on behalf of Israel that describes a marketing campaign to sell the second war in Iraq.
Yeah, well, you remember the movie that came out around the same time, Wag the Dog?
Yeah.
They couldn't have. That was. I got to feel that was pretty accurate. So I'll tell you one of the interesting things about George W. is you'll hear people describe him as being a dullard, not that smart, pretty average intelligence. Would have been 2009. I had just left my Wall Street firm. Bush had just left office. Guy I knew was an independent financial advisor, which is what I was then doing for a living. Had been invited to a big Charles Schwab conference where they invite like the top 100 independent financial advisors in the country to come, get the muckety muck convention. We had some great keynote speakers. Well, the keynote speaker that year was George W. Bush. And the guy I knew who went there is a really sharp guy. You don't get to be that level of the investment world without being pretty sharp. He said he was blown away by how sharp Bush was. He went up there without cue cards and just started talking with the audience for 2 hours straight and kept them mesmerized. So anybody who thinks that he's a big old Southern dummy, I've got anecdotal evidence that suggests otherwise.
So I saw him obviously in the capacity of president a couple of different times in a very intimate setting. And he does not, to me, that was an act. His appearing to be kind of dull. But if you look at him and look at what his deeds were, he destroyed our education system with No Child Left Behind. He basically wrote the document that gave Anthony Fauci basically like a blank check for AIDS. We had 9/11. And there's no way you can ever convince me that 9/11 was not an Operation Gladio event. And so there's so much. He got the Patriot Act, him and Porter Goss, who, by the way, somehow ends up as not only the CIA director, but then as a representative who just so happens to be in office to write the Patriot Act and get it passed and blah, blah, blah. None of that is an accident. And that was a core, and it all happened while he was basically up there as the conducting the entire thing. So you can think what you want about him, but those 8 years pivotally changed the United States forever.
Without a doubt. We got the forever wars for 20 years and counting almost out of his lovely decisions. You can't talk about George W. Bush without talking about the savings and loan scandal of the 80s, because his fingerprints are all over it. The thing to really understand about what happened with the savings and loan scandal, it was deregulation. So I can find something real quick.
While you're finding that, let me talk about what I found with the savings and loan scandal, just from a Gladio perspective. If you look at some of the back players of Gladio, you find that a lot of them here in the United States, whether they were previous political people or bankers that were involved in different aspects of it, they all end up on boards of savings and loans just prior to the savings and loan collapse. And basically what they were doing looks exactly what they do at BCCI and Nugent Hannon Castle Bank, which all collapse as well. And they were taking, like the example that I use is if you had 3 banks in Texas, because Texas was a big part, which is I'm sure the part that you're going to tell us about. You look at the major savings and loans that collapsed in Texas, you would find on the board of directors of, let's just say, A, B, and C. Well, the C guys some of them were on A and B, and then the B, some of them were on A and C. And they ended up all making loans to themselves for millions of dollars, and they were all uncollateralized. So there's no, and so basically it ends up being a major money laundering episode, which is exactly what they were doing at BCCI, Nugent Hand. And the similarities, when I started looking into that, I was just like mind blown.
The similarities are all over the place. So really what kicked it off was they deregulated the banking industry in 1982. And the big thing was when it came to what were called thrifts or savings and loans, they used to have a requirement that you had to have a minimum of 400 shareholders, and no shareholder could own more than 25%. They changed that in 1982 so you could have a single shoulder to own up to 100%. And as you might expect, this brought out some of the worst people and attracted some of the nastiest types to the S&L industry. There's a book called Inside Job, The Looting of America's Savings and Loans. And as a quote says, many of the entrepreneurs attracted by these changes were actually con men intent upon draining as much money from the system as they could get and then moving on.
I'd almost call them CIA assets.
Well, there's definitely some connection there, without a doubt. And we can get into that. We get into that a little bit. Basically, savings and loans did single family real estate loans, which means you want the money to be good. It's supposed to be pretty good backed asset class, but they leverage these banks like you wouldn't believe. Who own these people? Well, a lot of power structure of the country. Big players. A lot of these guys are out of Houston. Was Lloyd Benson, huge Democrat Party power broker throughout the 60s and 70s and even later. Lloyd Benson was twice a presidential candidate or almost. Orrin Hatch, the Utah senator, recently resigned or would have stepped down in 2018 or something like that. Yeah, he was big involved. Both the Bush children, Neil and George W., were involved, and also James Baker was really deep into it. One of the big movers and shakers, we've met him before, is a guy by the name of Walter Mischer, Mischer. He's a big Houston banker. He worked with Allied Bank, which is the third largest bank in Houston. Mischer had a lot of connections to organized crime, and that's where you get the mafia organization in there. Did a lot of work with charity work, like in the hospitals. Those are insider dealings, all kinds of crook. And of course, he was very close to LBJ. Mischer did a lot of business with Carlos Marcello, who of course was the New Orleans mafia boss. You'll get a lot of organized crime in this S&L crisis. And it's important to note that Mischer's kids did go to school with the Bush children. They were very close. Mischer's got a fascinating background. When he was 30, he was a sewer contractor, somehow bought into a bunch of Honduran paper mills, ended up selling them to Clint Mickelson Jr. And in 1952, that land that he had, the paper mills in Honduras were where they staged the 1952 United Fruit coup of Guatemala. So that's your boy, James Mischer. And he's deep involved with Bush and the savings and loans. He also bought a bunch of land in Texas where the drug planes and Iran-Contra were landing. One of the biggest losses. Go ahead.
That's amazing.
Yeah, he's an interesting connection. You start getting more and more mafia connections in here. You talk about James Baker, not mafia, but he had money involved in Mainland Savings, who lent money to Khashoggi.
Yes.
And Baker was a huge partner in Mainland Savings. Sunrise Savings, one of the biggest bankruptcies, and about $700 million lost. George Herbert Walker Bush intervened in that investigation. Nobody went to jail. Another mafia guy is a guy by the name of Herman K. Beebe. And he's out of La Costa, California, near my old hometown. Mafia organization. He's connected to Barry Seal. So that's Herman K. Beebe. All these guys were running SNLs in the same partnerships. And you're right, they sat on each other's board. One of the great ones is Neil Bush, who had settled in Colorado. He sets up Silverado Savings. Neil Bush's partner in Silverado Savings was a guy that we discovered in Russiagate or talked about by the name of Stephen Halper, whose father was Ray Klein, father-in-law. Um,
The same Stephen Halper that was involved in the Trump
the,
scandal.
the absolute same Stephen Halper. You ready for this? He was the last entry in Oliver North's White House diaries.
Yes, he was.
He was very close to Oliver North. All this, but that circles back to Neil Bush and Silverado. So he settles into Denver with Silverado. Silverado was bankrupt big time, the big bank. That's why we bring this up. But he's friends with the family members of John Hinckley Jr., who's the guy who shot President Reagan when his father was the vice president.
Who was having dinner the night it happened.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Bush had a relationship with a controversial Russian oligarch by the name of Berezovsky, who's a big enemy of Putin. I think Berezovsky ended up in London, Moscow, and the Tame. And of course, yeah, that's about it. Enough on the savings and loan, but that's quite a bit of connections there. These people were not afraid to, play the old boys game. That's what they did.
So you mentioned Orrin Hatch. Of course, he has direct ties to BCCI too.
Yeah, which oversight committees he sat on forever?
Finance and Foreign Affairs and Intel. Yeah. All of Operation Gladio.
Oh, it's as if you put your people in the choke points to control the investigation. Well, I think we beat up the Bushes pretty good. Again, we don't know who was in Skull and Bones after 1997, but I'm sure they're going to try to, we haven't seen the last of the Bush political dynasty, but I do think it's great that both Bushes, on their way out the door, had their approval ratings drop over 50% in their final year. So maybe we've had enough of them.
I don't know that we have not seen. I think after what happened to Jeb Bush in Florida and the complete humiliation the Bush family in Texas is basically dead as well. So I'm not sure that we haven't seen the last of them. I mean, we can pray.
Yeah, it's about, what we say earlier, what are the odds of two people from the same family? Or how about, people from the same secret society? So taking a step back, we've been trying to answer the question, who are the people who pull the puppet strings? Are these secret societies a way that they keep each other in check, how they network with each other, how they are basically create a ruling class? And you see the same connections over and over and over again. And there's probably no family that epitomize this more than the Bushes.
I completely agree with that assessment.
At least three of the generations, at least, probably deserve to go to jail.
Well, and we didn't even talk about their other siblings like Marvin, and he was in that scandal up in DC. There's lots of scandals. Jeb Bush was in a scandal down in Miami that was related to the CIA. So we were sticking strictly to the players of the Skull and Bone, but that is a very, very corrupt family.
Yeah, and if you look at them, they come from the blue blood families of America and Europe. We see their lineage, and the way we define corruption, they probably think it's their version of America first. Is basically they want to protect American corporations, American institutions, and they'll do anything to do it. But it's not the America we've been sold that we live under. It's not a constitutional republic. If you have this oligarchical class and dynastic families, they get to sit in that area. They get to sit in the chairs of power, while the rest of us are getting crumbs and paying for it as their tax slaves. This is not the way America is supposed to work, and they know it.
And it does seem like the Skull and Bones produces the minions to go out and work for that oligarchical, the step above them. So these guys all get to live like they're the actual oligarchs. And I think that's part of the whole psyops. But they really are the executive worker level puppets that are controlled by another layer that is invisible to us, because and I do believe, which is why I was excited about doing this, it becomes clearer and clearer that they are operating as a hive. So there's a lot of coordination that has to go into the movement of the musical chairs that they all play to ensure that everybody lands. Like, for example, Porter Goss is such a great example of, this guy that's CIA, but then he's placed down and given a front business in South Florida, and he just so happens to be there when there needs to be someone appointed, and then he just so happens to be in Washington, D.C. when we need the Patriot Act. And so there is a lot of coordination that is required to pull this entire effort off. And it is a logical place to start grooming people while they're in college in a secret society like Skull and Bones to be able to test their allegiance, to groom them up, to place them in these critical node positions.
Yeah, and we're not going to suggest that Skull and Bones are the preeminent, they run everything, but they do represent a certain faction of big old money, like the Cowboys and the defense military industrial complex are in there. There are other factions that are reasonable in American business. You've got the Hollywood group, you've got the Silicon Valley, you've got the Wall Street group, you've got the whole Steel Belt, Rust Belt, which used to be very powerful until we gave away a lot of their power. There are different interests that are going to put their politicians in, and it is a global Game of Thrones. These people always jockeying. But what I find interesting about the Skull and Bones faction is they seem to be the ones that control foreign policy and the intel agencies far more than any other. And that's where the money's to be made.
Absolutely.
Well, next week, I think we want to try to do a little more on Skull and Bones, because there's about another 7 or 8 names that really deserve a deeper dive into that we haven't gotten to.
Okay. It's a date.
We're doing it next Thursday?
Next Thursday at noon.
Noon Eastern. Great. Well, thank you for having me on again. This was fun.
It was awesome. Thank you for being here, Warhamster. This has been an exciting, and I do think the synergies between your research and my research plays out in these topical, very relevant topics. So thanks for being with me. I appreciate that.
I've had a couple of people say that I should have been, they don't want me to ever do another show without you, that we're complimentary, apparently. So I take that as a compliment.
I do too. I'm just constantly amazed at how you have done so much research. Obviously, I've done research, and I am just fascinated every time we talk without any pre-planning that we are able to just roll through this thing because it all fits together, and I love it. So again, thank you for being here. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks for everybody that's been in the chat. I've been watching. I see Patriot Sarah and Renee and Deplorable, Kofifi. Love you guys. A lot of our normal people from Spaces over on X. I appreciate all of you for being here. Renee. So everybody, thanks for being here. And
I didn't even notice my buddy Christian Sass was in there. Hey, Christian. I scrolled up a little bit. Didn't even see you earlier. I was too busy caught up and talking.
It is kind of hard to do both. There are some people that are very good at that. I'm not one of them. And so I usually try to take a minute at the end and kind of go through. I just appreciate everybody being here. Pool 14. Anyway, thanks everyone for being here. I'll see everybody at 4:00 this afternoon for another session of our book club over on X. And we'll be here on Rumble too,
and Happy New Year, everyone.
Yes, Happy New Year. Have a wonderful next holiday, and then we'll be back next Thursday. Thanks again.